We talk about money as if we understand it, but do we really know where it sleeps when the world isn't watching? Somewhere beyond our maps, there's a silence worth trillions, and it tells a story few are willing to hear. There is a strange stillness to the places where money hides. From the air, the Cayman Islands look like paradise. Turquoise water, white sand, quiet roads curving through palm trees. Yet beneath this calm lies something unseen, a world where trillions of dollars rest in silence. Bank accounts without faces, companies without people, addresses that hold nothing but names on paper. Offshore finance was never built for beauty. It was built for distance, the space between wealth and responsibility. Over time, that distance became an industry of its own. Nations learned to trade in laws instead of goods. They offered secrecy instead of sunlight. For the right fee, they promised a safe place to disappear. It began quietly after the Second World War, when money started to move faster than countries could follow. New tax systems rose, and with them, new ways to escape them. A few clever bankers saw an opportunity. If the world was rebuilding its rules, why not create places where the rules could bend? Out of that idea grew the modern offshore network, an invisible web connecting boardrooms in London and New York to filing cabinets in Bermuda and the British Virgin Islands. But this story isn't only about greed or crime. It's about trust, fear, and the human need to feel safe. The idea of keeping money offshore began as a way to protect it, from governments, from instability, from loss. Yet as secrecy deepened, protection became concealment. What started as shelter turned into shadow. Today, this hidden system holds more wealth than most nations can imagine. It shapes who pays and who does not. It decides which countries prosper and which struggle to stay afloat. And though it feels distant, behind palm trees and glass towers, its effects ripple quietly through every economy, every public service, every life touched by inequality. To understand offshore banking is to understand the world's hidden design, the quiet architecture of power that decides far more than markets ever could. If you stay with me through this journey, you'll see how money moves in ways few ever witness, and how understanding its path can change the way you see fairness, opportunity, and even your own place in the system. So take a breath, let's step behind the curtain, into the silence where paradise and profit meet. Chapter 1: The Birth of the Offshore Idea. The story begins not on an island, but in a boardroom. The year was 1946. The world was still recovering from war. Cities were rebuilding, currencies were shifting, and people were learning again how to trust money. Governments had started taxing heavily to pay for reconstruction. The wealthy, who had once been able to move freely across borders, suddenly felt watched. Banks were no longer just vaults for cash. They were instruments of national policy. Every dollar earned had a direction, and every direction had a rule. In London, a quiet group of lawyers and bankers began to imagine something new. They saw that while countries controlled their own money, no one truly controlled where that money could go. A company could open a branch in another country. A bank could hold deposits in another currency. A contract written in one place could take effect in another. In these gray spaces between nations, they saw opportunity, not to break laws, but to exist between them. It was here in the post-war calm that the seed of offshore banking took root. The idea was simple. What if a person or company could hold money in a place where the rules were lighter, the taxes lower, and the questions fewer? It was not illegal. It was, in many ways, clever. A small rearrangement of geography that changed how wealth behaved. The first experiment began with the Eurodollar market. American dollars held in European banks were outside U.S. control. Britain, still a financial center but no longer an empire, realized it could serve as a bridge for this floating money. It could host the world's capital without asking too many questions. Soon, London bankers began opening branches in places like Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man. Small territories where British influence remained strong, but regulation was light. The phrase offshore originally had nothing to do with palm trees or secrecy. It was a technical term, meaning money held outside the shores of one's own country. But as decades passed, the meaning drifted. Offshore began to mean hidden, private, protected. It became a word that sounded distant and safe, like something placed gently beyond reach. In the 1950s and 60s, the idea spread quietly across oceans. Switzerland had already built its reputation on discretion, a neutral nation whose banks were famous for silence. But small islands began to notice that they could offer something similar and perhaps more. They had no natural resources to sell, no big industries to rely on, but they had sovereignty, or at least the shadow of it. They could write their own laws. They could promise what larger nations could not: invisibility. The Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the Bahamas, each began to shape itself into a financial refuge. They passed laws that welcomed foreign banks, allowed companies to register with minimal information, and charged almost no tax. To attract the wealthy, they offered stability wrapped in secrecy. A company could be set up in a day. A bank account could be opened with no questions about where the money came from. This was not an act of rebellion, it was survival. These islands had been colonies, dependent, overlooked, often poor. The global economy had left them behind, and offshore finance became their bridge to relevance. By inviting the world's capital to flow through them, they found a strange kind of power. They could not control the seas or armies, but they could control the laws that governed money. By the 1970s, offshore banking had become a quiet revolution. Multinational corporations realized they could reduce taxes simply by shifting profits through low-tax jurisdictions. Wealthy individuals learned that they could protect assets from scrutiny by moving them abroad. Banks set up subsidiaries that existed mostly on paper, but on paper they were profitable. What made this new system powerful was not its secrecy alone, but its legitimacy. Every step could be defended as legal. Every company had a registration number. Every account had documentation. Yet behind the paperwork lay an invisible intent: to separate ownership from accountability. It was during these years that the language of finance began to soften the reality it described. The words tax haven became financial center, secrecy became privacy, evasion became optimization. In this gentle rephrasing, a moral shift took place. The world began to accept the idea that hiding money was not necessarily wrong. It was simply strategic. Governments, too, played their part. Many of the first havens were connected to powerful nations. The British Crown dependencies operated under London's shadow. Caribbean territories relied on the protection and influence of Western powers. The United States, though publicly critical of secrecy, quietly allowed its own states. Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming, to become domestic havens. The system grew not against global authority, but within it. As the offshore world expanded, so did its complexity. Layers of companies could be stacked like mirrors, one inside another, reflecting nothing but themselves. A business registered in the Cayman Islands could be owned by a trust in Jersey, which was managed by a firm in Switzerland, which was controlled by a private foundation in Panama. Each layer added distance between the money and the person behind it. For those who built this system, the appeal was not just financial, it was psychological. Offshore banking offered freedom from oversight, but also from fear. The fear of losing what had been earned, of being targeted, of being seen. In a world growing more connected, the wealthy sought invisibility as their final luxury. And so, what began as a clever financial workaround became a global architecture of concealment. By the 1980s, trillions of dollars flowed through offshore centers each year. Money no longer belonged to countries, it belonged to structures, and those structures belonged to no one. Yet even in its early years, the offshore world carried an irony. It was built on the idea of escaping national control, yet it depended on nations to exist. Every haven relied on powerful economies to send it money, on international law to protect its sovereignty, on global systems to keep it running smoothly. The offshore world was not separate from the world. It was the world's reflection, sharper and quieter. In the distance between rules and reality, between what was allowed and what was right, a new kind of power took shape. Invisible, unaccountable, but entirely human in its design. The birth of offshore finance was not an accident or conspiracy. It was the outcome of a simple human pattern. When systems grow too heavy, people look for lighter ones. When control tightens, escape becomes an industry. By the end of the century, the offshore idea had grown far beyond islands or banks. It had become a mindset, the belief that wealth should flow freely, untouched by borders, unseen by others. And once the world accepted that belief, the boundaries between legal and moral, visible and hidden, began to blur. In that blur, the modern offshore era began, an invisible empire built not on land or armies, but on the quiet rearrangement of trust. Chapter 2: The Geography of Secrecy. There's a certain beauty in the way secrecy hides behind paradise. Palm trees, blue water, soft winds that move slowly across white sand, all of it a perfect disguise. From a distance, these islands look untouched by power, but beneath their calm surfaces, they hold some of the most complex financial networks on Earth. The geography of secrecy was not chosen for beauty, but beauty helped it survive. It offered a mask the world would never question. It began with small territories, places that had once been ports, colonies, or military outposts. When the age of empire faded, many of them were left adrift. Their soil was thin, their economies fragile. They had no oil to sell, no factories to build. What they did have was sovereignty, or at least the pieces of it. The right to write laws, the right to register companies, the right to promise things no larger nation could. The Cayman Islands were one of the first to understand what this meant. In the 1960s, they passed laws that allowed foreign banks to operate without paying local tax. They guaranteed confidentiality and offered protection from outside investigations. They built an entire financial system on paper, not on land. Within 2 decades, the number of registered companies was greater than the number of residents. Every year, billions of dollars passed through offices that held no desks, no employees, sometimes not even a door. Bermuda followed, then the British Virgin Islands, the Bahamas, and Jersey. Each island crafted its own formula of secrecy and leniency. They became known as offshore financial centers, but the truth was simpler. They were ports for invisible ships, places where money could anchor briefly before sailing elsewhere. Geography made them ideal. Islands stood apart. Their physical isolation mirrored their legal isolation. They were close enough to major economies to attract capital, yet distant enough to resist political pressure. A phone call, a fax, later an email. That was all it took to move a fortune. The sea, once a barrier, became a symbol of protection. As the network grew, a quiet competition formed among havens. Each promised more privacy, faster incorporation, lighter taxes. The Bahamas offered numbered accounts. The Channel Islands guaranteed no disclosure of company owners. Panama created foundations that could hold assets in perpetuity. The goal was not only to attract money, but to attract the kind of money that wanted to stay unseen. The irony was striking. These places had once depended on tourism and trade. Now their greatest export was secrecy, and secrecy required almost nothing, just laws, signatures, and trust. A single building in Georgetown or Road Town could hold thousands of companies, each one a name on a list, each one a door that opened into nowhere. For the local populations, the change was quiet but visible. Streets filled with new banks and law firms. Construction boomed. Hotels and schools improved. Yet behind this prosperity was a strange emptiness. Most of the wealth that passed through never stayed. It existed in transit. Intangible, borderless, and indifferent to the place that hosted it. London, Zurich, and New York were never far from these islands. The real decisions were made in their glass towers. The Caribbean and the Channel Islands were extensions, satellites orbiting the centers of global finance. The lawyers who drafted offshore structures often lived thousands of miles away. The clients, too, rarely visited. To them, the islands were not destinations. They were mechanisms. The geography of secrecy expanded far beyond the tropics. Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland offered European versions of the same promise. Singapore and Hong Kong became Asian hubs, blending strict order with quiet discretion. Even within the United States, states like Delaware began to mimic offshore systems, offering anonymous companies that could be created in minutes. The word offshore no longer meant surrounded by sea. It meant surrounded by silence. This spreading map of secrecy reshaped the idea of borders. Money no longer followed geography, it followed opportunity. A corporation could be born in one country, hold assets in another, pay taxes in none, and operate everywhere. The laws of small islands began to affect the lives of millions who had never heard of them. The geography of the world tilted slightly, not along continents, but along lines of permission. What made these places powerful was not their size, but their neutrality. They did not question the source of money. They did not choose sides in politics. They offered what every investor craved: certainty. In an uncertain world, they became calm waters. They turned discretion into a service and silence into a product. In time, secrecy became a kind of brand. The Cayman Islands were no longer just a dot on the map. They were a symbol of safety for the global elite. Swiss banks were not just institutions, they were metaphors for trust. The language surrounding these havens softened to match their image. Instead of tax shelter, people said asset management. Instead of secrecy, they said confidentiality. The world's moral vocabulary adjusted to accommodate its financial desires. Yet the islands themselves began to feel the weight of their role. They were praised for efficiency, but criticized for enabling inequality. International organizations called them out as tax havens, a term they rejected but could never escape. They defended themselves by saying they followed the law. And they did. The laws simply favored those who could afford to use them. What these small territories revealed was something larger than finance. They showed how power can shift quietly from governments to systems. Each haven was a microstate in service to a global network, a small piece of a vast puzzle that no one fully controlled. Their laws, though local, shaped decisions in distant boardrooms. Their calm beaches hid the machinery of global wealth. The geography of secrecy thrived because it offered something both sides of the world wanted. The rich sought protection, the poor sought opportunity. The islands gave both, though not equally. They became middlemen in a trade between ambition and avoidance, earning stability by selling invisibility. And yet the story was never purely cynical. Many who built these systems saw them as pragmatic, even necessary. They believed they were creating neutral ground in a world of unstable politics and rising taxes. They argued that offshore finance helped money flow where it was needed, that it fueled investment and trade. There was truth in this, but like all truths about money, it was partial. For behind the promise of neutrality lay dependency. Offshore centers relied on the very instability they claimed to escape. Their strength came from the weaknesses of others, from mistrust, inequality, and fear of government reach. If the world ever became truly fair and transparent, their advantage would fade. Their prosperity depended on the shadows staying dark. By the end of the 20th century, the geography of secrecy had solidified into something permanent. Maps of the financial world no longer matched maps of the physical one. Invisible lines connected Zurich to Singapore, London to the Cayman Islands, New York to Delaware. Money traveled faster than law, and law bent to follow it. Standing on the beach of any of these islands, the scene still feels peaceful. Waves folding gently against the shore, sun sliding across the water. But beneath that calm lies a truth both beautiful and unsettling. The same ocean that separates nations also connects their secrets. In this network of calm seas and silent offices, wealth found its perfect refuge, and as the rest of the world looked toward the horizon, imagining freedom and escape, the real movement was already happening beneath the surface, where paradise and secrecy had become one and the same. Chapter 3: Shells and Shadows. It begins with a name on a piece of paper. A company is born, not in a factory or an office, but in the quiet click of a keyboard. It has no workers, no building, no product to sell. Yet in the eyes of the law it exists. Alive, independent, capable of owning millions. This is the shell company, the most delicate and powerful tool of the offshore world. It is both a symbol and a disguise, a way to turn money into mist and mist back into money. The shell company was not invented for secrecy. At first, it was a convenience, a way to make trade easier, to separate risk from ownership. If a ship sank or a deal failed, the company would take the loss, not the person behind it. But over time, the idea evolved. Lawyers realized that a company did not need to do anything to be useful. It only needed to exist. Existence itself became a service. In the 1960s and 70s, as offshore finance expanded, this idea turned into an industry. Small law firms in places like Panama and the British Virgin Islands began offering ready-made companies. For a modest fee, anyone could buy a legal identity. The firm would prepare the documents, sign the forms, and even provide directors, usually clerks or secretaries whose names appeared on thousands of businesses. These were nominee directors, faces for companies that belonged to others. To the outside world, everything looked proper. The company had a board, an address, a charter, but behind the paperwork, the true owner remained invisible. This was the genius of the shell. It created distance without disorder. Ownership could shift hands in seconds, yet the company's name would never change. It was a perfect mask, one that obeyed every rule while concealing every truth. The most famous factory of shells was Mossack Fonseca, the Panamanian law firm later exposed by the Panama Papers. For decades, they specialized in manufacturing identities. They offered thousands of companies, each tailored to the needs of its owner. Politicians, businessmen, celebrities, and criminals alike. The process was simple, efficient, almost mechanical. A client filled out a form. A clerk signed a few papers. A company was born, complete with an address and directors who had never heard of it. Behind the calm language of incorporation and registration, a quiet transformation took place. The company, once a symbol of enterprise, became a tool of concealment. In the old world, ownership meant responsibility. If you owned something, your name was tied to it. The shell company untied that knot. It allowed people to own without being seen. It created a legal distance between wealth and accountability, between presence and proof. Each shell was a small illusion, but together they formed a vast architecture of shadows. Money could move through layers of these companies, each one obscuring the last. A payment might flow from London to a shell in the British Virgin Islands, then to another in Panama, then to a bank in Zurich, before ending up in real estate in New York or art in Geneva. Each step was legal. Each step was invisible. The true power of this system lay not in its secrecy alone, but in its ordinariness. These companies were registered in plain sight. Their documents sat in public registries. Their names appeared in databases, but those names meant nothing. They were shells, hollow structures built to look full, and because there were so many of them, they became normal. The extraordinary disappeared into the ordinary. Governments and regulators struggled to keep up. Each time a new law required disclosure, a new layer of ownership appeared. Trusts owned companies, which owned other trusts, which held shares through nominee directors. It was a maze designed not to confuse, but to tire, to make anyone following the trail lose patience before they found the truth. For those inside the system, the shell company became a kind of language. It allowed them to speak in abstractions, to talk about assets and entities instead of people. It replaced names with structures, emotions with logic, and in that shift something human was lost. When money hides, intention hides with it. But behind every shell there is always a reason. Some are innocent. A small business owner in a volatile country may use a shell company to protect assets from political risk. A family may use one to pass wealth quietly to the next generation. Others, however, use the same tools to avoid taxes, conceal corruption, or launder money. The line between protection and deception is thin, and offshore finance thrives in that space where both coexist. In the 1980s and 90s, as globalization accelerated, the demand for shells exploded. They became the basic building blocks of global finance. Banks used them to structure investments. Corporations used them to shift profits. Individuals used them to move wealth without scrutiny. The shells multiplied faster than governments could track them. By the early 2000s, experts estimated that more than 2 million offshore companies existed worldwide. Their reach was everywhere. A skyscraper in London could be owned by a company in Jersey, which was controlled by another in the Bahamas, which was held by a trust in Liechtenstein. If something went wrong, a financial collapse, a tax investigation, a political scandal, each layer could dissolve into the next. Responsibility would vanish, absorbed by the structure itself. For those who built and managed these shells, there was a strange pride in their craft. They spoke of efficiency, privacy, flexibility. They believed they were serving a global economy that demanded speed and security, and in a way they were right. The world had grown too complex for simple ownership. The shell company was not an accident, it was a response to complexity. Yet complexity often hides intent. The more layers a system has, the less it reveals about what it truly serves. And so, over time, the offshore world became less about protection and more about power. The quiet power of those who could afford to vanish behind paper walls. The phrase shell company carries a kind of poetry. A shell protects what is soft inside. It shields it from the elements, from danger, but it also isolates. It hides life behind something hard and empty. The offshore system built millions of such shells, each one an echo of human fear and desire, fear of loss, desire for safety, and the belief that the world's problems can be escaped, not solved. Standing in an office in the British Virgin Islands, surrounded by files and forms, one might not see anything remarkable. Just names, dates, signatures. Yet each document is a fragment of a larger story. A story about how wealth learned to hide in plain sight. The true weight of the shell company is not in the paper it's printed on, but in the silence it maintains. By the time the world began to question these structures, the shadows had already become too deep. Laws were written, reforms promised, registries opened, but the system had already evolved. It no longer depended on a few firms or islands. It lived everywhere in the global flow of money itself. And so the shell remains. An elegant invention born from necessity, perfected by greed and sustained by fear. A reflection of the human instinct to protect, to control, and to conceal. Each company a name without a face, each face a shadow behind glass, and in their quiet coexistence the offshore world continues to grow, one empty shell at a time. Chapter 4: The Power of Privacy. There is a certain peace that comes with being unseen. It is the same quiet one feels when standing in a room with the lights off, watching the world from behind a curtain. You are there, but you are not visible. In the world of money, that feeling became a service. The sale of invisibility, the promise of control through privacy. Offshore finance was built not only on numbers and laws, but on this deep human need to feel safe from exposure. Privacy has always been a form of protection. For individuals, it guards dignity. For families, it guards inheritance. For businesses, it guards strategy. But in the financial world, privacy grew into something larger, a kind of armor for wealth. It allowed the powerful to exist beyond reach, to move without being traced, to build empires in silence. The language of secrecy softened as it spread. It was no longer called hiding, it was called discretion. No longer avoidance, but protection. The world learned to admire the calm of those who never had to explain. In the years after the offshore system was born, banks and law firms discovered how to turn privacy into an asset. Confidentiality became their most valuable product. A banker in Zurich could look a client in the eye and promise something that no government could: silence. No questions, no disclosures, no records that could be found. For many, this was not about crime. It was about trust. In a world shaken by war, revolution, and economic collapse, secrecy felt like stability. It was a refuge built from quietness. The Swiss perfected this art. Their banking secrecy laws, written in the 1930s, made it a crime to reveal a client's identity. The idea had noble origins: to protect assets from political persecution in turbulent times. But by the late 20th century, those same laws had become a shield for all kinds of money, good and bad. The Swiss were not alone. From Luxembourg to Liechtenstein, small nations turned privacy into a national brand. The message was clear: bring your money here, and it will never be touched. The appeal of this promise was not just practical, it was emotional. To hide wealth was to regain control in a world that constantly demanded a share of it. Governments taxed, societies judged, families fought, markets fluctuated. But inside a private bank or behind an offshore structure, the chaos stopped. Everything was quiet, orderly, secure. For those who could afford it, secrecy offered not just safety but serenity. Over time, this culture of privacy reshaped the values of finance itself. Transparency came to be seen as naive, openness as dangerous. The more hidden wealth became, the more respectable it seemed. Bankers, lawyers, and advisors built careers around managing invisibility. They learned to speak in soft, careful tones, never naming, never confirming, always protecting. Secrecy became professionalism. Discretion became virtue. And yet, beneath this calm surface, something subtle began to shift. The same privacy that protected the innocent also protected the corrupt. The same walls that shielded legitimate wealth also hid stolen fortunes. Dictators, traffickers, and fraudsters discovered that the system made no moral distinction. It asked only one question: could you pay the fee? Offshore networks were blind by design, and in that blindness, everything became equal. The defenders of secrecy argued that privacy was a fundamental right. They were not entirely wrong. In a world where governments could seize assets or freeze accounts overnight, confidentiality was a form of freedom. In places where corruption ran deep, it could even be a shield against injustice. But when privacy becomes absolute, it turns into its opposite. It stops protecting and starts hiding. It stops serving the person and starts serving the power. The offshore world found itself trapped between these two meanings. Its architects spoke the language of trust and protection, but its users often sought evasion and concealment. The line between privacy and secrecy blurred until it disappeared. What was once a shield became a shadow. To understand the power of privacy, one must understand its allure. It is not just about money. It is about identity. To be unseen is to be untouchable. It allows one to live without scrutiny, to exist outside judgment. In the eyes of many wealthy individuals, that was the ultimate form of independence. They could move across borders, invest in silence, own without revealing, give without disclosing. Their lives floated above the noise of politics and accountability. But invisibility, like all luxuries, carries a cost. The more some are protected, the more others are exposed. When the rich move their wealth offshore, the burden of funding societies falls on those who cannot. Taxes rise for the visible while disappearing for the hidden. Schools, hospitals, and public services slowly erode, not from neglect but from absence. The money is not gone, it has simply moved beyond sight. By the early 2000s, the idea of privacy had become so embedded in global finance that challenging it felt almost impossible. Governments made speeches about transparency but hesitated to act. Too many politicians, too many corporations, too many donors had something to lose. The offshore world was not a separate place. It was intertwined with the very systems meant to regulate it. Even as investigative journalists began to expose leaks, from Switzerland to Panama, the culture of secrecy endured. Each scandal produced outrage, but little changed. Banks adjusted their language, firms updated their websites, yet the structures remained. Privacy was too valuable to abandon. It had become a kind of quiet religion, worshipped not through belief but through habit. There is a strange morality in all of this. Those who protect secrecy often believe they are preserving order. They see themselves as guardians of privacy, not accomplices in injustice. And in many cases they are sincere. But sincerity does not erase consequence. The calm surface of offshore finance hides not only wealth but also imbalance. It is the stillness before a ripple, the silence that amplifies inequality. The power of privacy lies in its dual nature. It can be both a human right and a social wound. It can protect the vulnerable and empower the corrupt. It can create peace for one and pain for another. Offshore finance thrives in that tension. A system built on the illusion that what is private can remain separate from what is public. Yet nothing stays hidden forever. Leaks, whistleblowers, and digital trails have begun to pierce the veil. The world is starting to see that privacy, when turned into an industry, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a tool not of protection, but of control, a way for wealth to stay beyond reach while the rest of the world remains exposed. Still, the desire to remain unseen is not fading. If anything, it is growing. In an age of surveillance, data tracking, and digital transparency, secrecy feels more precious than ever. The offshore system understands this better than anyone. It adapts, it evolves, it sells comfort to those who fear exposure. It whispers the same promise it has whispered for decades. Your money is safe here. Your name will not be spoken. Your world will remain untouched. And so the power of privacy endures. Quiet, elegant, persuasive. It does not roar or demand. It simply exists, offering the one thing money has always wanted most, the right to be unseen. Chapter 5: The Panama Illusion. The story broke on a warm April evening. Millions of documents, 12 million in total, leaked from a small law firm in Panama City. The firm was called Mossack Fonseca. For decades, its offices had sat quietly behind tinted windows, known only to those who needed to know. But in 2016, its files were opened to the world. Inside them was the architecture of invisibility, the blueprints of how modern secrecy was built. The leak became known as the Panama Papers, and for a brief moment, the hidden world of offshore finance was pulled into the light. What the world saw was not chaos or corruption in its raw form. It was order, cold, meticulous, and bureaucratic. There were spreadsheets and signatures, invoices and company seals. There were emails between bankers, lawyers, and clients. There was nothing cinematic about it, nothing dramatic, just documents. But together, they told a story of how ordinary paper could hold extraordinary power. The Panama Papers revealed a pattern more human than criminal. Politicians, athletes, billionaires, and business leaders all used the same quiet pathways. They registered companies in the British Virgin Islands, opened accounts in Panama, and moved money through Switzerland and Luxembourg. Many were not breaking the law, they were bending it, stretching its edges until transparency faded into ambiguity. The leak showed not a few bad actors, but a system functioning exactly as designed. At first, the world reacted with outrage. There were protests, investigations, resignations. A few names made headlines. The Prime Minister of Iceland, close associates of Vladimir Putin, relatives of China's political elite. The idea that global power could hide in tropical mailboxes unsettled people. But soon the noise faded. The complexity of the documents overwhelmed the anger. What was exposed was too vast, too intricate, too familiar. In truth, the Panama Papers were less a scandal than a mirror. They reflected a global order in which secrecy had become normal. Mossack Fonseca was not unique. It was one of hundreds of firms offering the same services: company registration, nominee directors, trusts, and foundations. Its downfall came not because it was exceptional, but because it was ordinary and unlucky. A single breach of its servers was enough to expose the quiet machinery that kept the offshore world running. Inside those files were thousands of stories. Some were small. A retired couple protecting their savings from unstable governments, a business shielding assets from lawsuits. Others were grand. Oil tycoons moving profits, politicians hiding kickbacks, corporations shifting billions to avoid tax. The documents did not draw a moral line between them. They showed only the same tool being used in different ways, driven by the same belief that safety lies in invisibility. What made the Panama Papers powerful was not what they revealed, but what they made visible: the texture of global inequality. The documents traced how money leaves places that need it most and settles in places that ask the fewest questions. They showed how public wealth becomes private, how responsibility thins as distance grows. Behind every shell company, there was a choice: to trust secrecy more than society. For the people of Panama, the scandal was a paradox. Their country's name became a symbol of corruption, yet the wealth flowing through it never truly belonged to them. Mossack Fonseca's offices employed a few hundred people, yet the fortunes they managed shaped the budgets of nations. The money came and went like tides, leaving no trace but paperwork. The irony was bitter. A small nation, once colonized by power, now blamed for sheltering it. The leak did more than expose individuals. It revealed the mindset of an era, the quiet normalization of hiding. Offshore finance had grown so integrated into global business that most of its users saw nothing wrong in using it. They were following advice from accountants, lawyers, and consultants who viewed secrecy as efficiency. It was no longer about evasion, it was optimization. The moral language of finance had changed. What was once shameful had become strategic. In the months after the leak, journalists worked day and night to trace the web of ownership. They followed trails that crossed continents, from Panama to London, from Moscow to Hong Kong. Each thread led to another, looping endlessly through jurisdictions. For every company exposed, 10 more stood untouched. The offshore system was not a single structure, but a shifting landscape. Close one door, and another opened somewhere else. Governments promised reform. Some new laws were passed. Transparency registers were discussed. Beneficial ownership records proposed. But the resistance was subtle and strong. Too much money depended on secrecy. Banks adapted quickly. They found quieter havens, more complex intermediaries, and safer digital vaults. Mossack Fonseca fell, but the network it served continued without pause. Still, something irreversible had changed. The illusion of innocence had cracked. Before the Panama Papers, secrecy existed in the background, invisible, abstract. Afterward, it had a face, a texture, a language. People began to see the connection between offshore wealth and their own lives, between the missing hospital funding and the billionaire's mailbox company, between the closed school and the tax-free trust. The invisible had become visible, even if only for a moment. The journalists who broke the story spoke often about what it felt like to read those documents. It was not anger that stayed with them, but sadness. The sadness of seeing how normalized secrecy had become, how ordinary people had been trained to accept inequality as inevitable. Each email, each company file, was a small act of detachment, another human choosing to look away from consequence. The Panama Papers did not end offshore secrecy. They revealed its depth. They showed how difficult it is to dismantle a system that benefits the most powerful. But they also proved something else, that even the most hidden worlds can be seen if enough light is cast. The leak came not from an institution, but from an individual. One person, somewhere, decided to share what was meant to remain buried. It was a quiet rebellion against the logic of silence. In the years that followed, more leaks came. The Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers, the Swiss Lakes. Each one added to the picture, each one reminding the world that secrecy is not invincible. Yet the pattern continued, because secrecy was never about villains or heroes. It was about trust misplaced. The trust in privacy to bring peace, the trust in systems to stay fair, the trust that what is hidden can remain harmless. Standing in Panama City today, you can still find the building where Mossack Fonseca once operated. The sign is gone. The offices are empty. The windows reflect sunlight like nothing ever happened. The streets are quiet, lined with palm trees and traffic. Life goes on, but in the silence there lingers a truth that cannot be erased. The world's money did not just pass through here. It hid here, waiting for no one to notice. The Panama Papers were a glimpse into that silence, a moment when the curtain was lifted and the audience saw the stage. The actors were not villains, just participants in a play that had gone on too long. When the curtain fell again, the world exhaled and returned to its routine. But for those who looked closely, the illusion had changed. Once you see how secrecy works, you cannot unsee it. The calm, the order, the paradise, all of it hides something heavy underneath. The illusion of Panama was never about place. It was about permission. The quiet, global agreement that wealth deserves its shadows. And as long as that belief endures, the story of the Panama Papers will not be history. It will be a mirror the world keeps turning away from, afraid of what it might still reflect. Chapter 6: The Legal Mirage. There's a comfort in the word legal. It feels solid, clean, and safe. like a wall that separates what is right from what is wrong. But in the offshore world, legality does not always mean clarity. The laws that govern hidden wealth are not walls, they are mirrors. They reflect the intentions of those who write them, bending light in ways that make truth difficult to see. Offshore finance thrives in this reflection, in the quiet space where legality becomes illusion. From the beginning, offshore banking was built not by criminals but by lawyers. They were the architects of invisibility. Every company, every trust, every offshore account started with a document written in careful, precise language. Nothing was hidden in those papers. Every clause could be explained. Every signature was legitimate. And yet the result was secrecy. The law did not fail. It was used exactly as intended. The brilliance of this system lies in its simplicity. No law firm says, "We help people hide money." They say, "We protect assets." No banker says, "We conceal ownership." They say, "We preserve privacy." The words are clean, the intentions polished. What happens in practice is a matter of perspective. One person's tax avoidance is another's tax efficiency. One person's secrecy is another's safety. Between those words lies the mirage. A shimmer of respectability that makes everything look lawful, even when it isn't fair. The legal foundation of offshore finance rests on a few small but powerful ideas. The first is sovereignty. Every nation has the right to make its own laws, including tax laws. Small jurisdictions realized they could use this power as a product. They wrote legislation that invited foreign wealth, promising low taxes, loose reporting, and strong protection of confidentiality. From the outside, these laws looked legitimate. They were passed by governments, signed by officials, published in public records. But their purpose was often not to serve citizens, but clients. The second idea is separation. The law allows entities to exist independently from the people who control them. A company is not a person. A trust is not its beneficiary. This separation, known as the corporate veil, is essential to business. It limits liability and allows trade to flourish. But when multiplied across hundreds of offshore structures, that same veil becomes a shroud. It allows ownership to vanish behind layers of legality. The veil was meant to protect innovation. Instead, it became a curtain for concealment. The third idea is jurisdictional distance. Laws apply differently depending on where you are. A contract signed in one country can be governed by the laws of another. Offshore finance uses this distance to its advantage. When scrutiny grows in one place, the paperwork simply shifts elsewhere. If a law requires transparency, a new company is formed in a jurisdiction that doesn't. The result is a moving target, a system that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. These principles are not hidden. They are taught in universities, written in textbooks, praised as the pillars of global trade. And yet, in the hands of those seeking invisibility, they become tools for escape. The same laws that protect honest enterprise protect hidden empires. The line between use and abuse dissolves in the language of compliance. Law firms, banks, and accountants form the ecosystem that sustains this mirage. They are intermediaries, translating human desires into legal shapes. Their job is not to judge, but to execute. When a client says, "I want to protect my assets," the lawyer drafts a trust. When a corporation says, "We want to minimize taxes," the accountant draws up a network of subsidiaries. Each step is justified by a clause, a precedent, a regulation. No one breaks the law. But together they bend it until it nearly snaps. This is what makes the offshore system so resilient. It is not built on corruption but on compliance. Every document has a signature. Every transaction has a receipt. Every transfer has a reason. It is not the absence of law that allows secrecy. It is the abundance of it. The rules are too many, too complex, too scattered across borders for anyone to follow them all. And in that complexity, accountability disappears. For those within the system, this is a point of pride. They speak of professionalism, not secrecy. They insist that what they do is legal and they are right. But legality is not morality. It never has been. The slave trade was once legal. Segregation was legal. Colonialism was legal. The law often lags behind the conscience, and in finance that gap has become a business model. Consider the language of tax havens. They do not call themselves that. They call themselves international financial centers. Their laws are framed as reforms, their secrecy as competitiveness. They argue that attracting wealth brings prosperity, and sometimes it does, but not for the many. The benefits pool at the top while the costs ripple outward. When corporations avoid taxes legally, public budgets shrink legally too. The hospitals that close, the schools that decay, the wages that stagnate. These are all legal outcomes. In this sense, the offshore world mirrors the global economy itself. It does not defy the system, it perfects it. It exposes the true shape of capitalism, borderless, adaptable, and loyal only to itself. The legal mirage makes it seem as if everything is functioning as it should, when in truth the system is working precisely because of its flaws. The illusion is not that the law is broken, but that it was ever whole. Some lawyers have tried to challenge this logic from within. They argue that laws should reflect fairness, not just permission. That transparency should be a principle, not a punishment. But these voices are often drowned by the larger chorus of profit. The global market rewards efficiency, not ethics. And efficiency in this case means invisibility. The most striking thing about this mirage is how calm it feels. There are no gunmen, no gangs, no violence, just documents and meetings, contracts and coffee. The offshore world is not a crime scene. It is a conference room. It is the quiet hum of air conditioning, the click of a pen, the smooth passing of a file across a polished table. It is a world that looks civilized because it is. That is what makes it so untouchable. In the end, the legal mirage depends on faith. Faith that the law is always just, that compliance equals integrity, that what is written cannot be wrong. But faith is fragile. Each leak, each investigation, each whisper of reform chips away at the illusion. The truth is not that the system is illegal, but that legality itself has been stretched thin, so thin that light passes through it. The law was meant to be a boundary. Offshore finance turned it into a horizon, something that moves further away the closer you get. And as long as that horizon exists, the mirage will remain. It will shimmer in the heat of global wealth, drawing those who seek safety, those who seek profit, and those who simply seek to disappear. The world will call it lawful. The world will call it efficient. But when the illusion fades, what remains is simple. A system that obeys every rule while quietly undoing the meaning of fairness itself. Chapter 7. The Architecture of Inequality. There's a quiet elegance to inequality. It does not shout. It builds itself slowly, layer by layer, like a city made of glass. From a distance it looks orderly. towers of wealth rising from a landscape of labor, but up close the lines blur, the foundations disappear. The wealth at the top rests on structures few can see. Offshore finance is one of those structures, invisible yet indispensable. It does not cause inequality on its own, but it perfects it. It gives it form, protection, and permanence. In the visible economy, money moves in circles. It is earned, taxed, spent, and reinvested. Each turn leaves a trace, a record of contribution. But in the offshore world, money moves in straight lines, from one account to another, from one jurisdiction to the next, never looping back into the societies it leaves. The result is a quiet siphoning, a redistribution in reverse. Wealth flows upward and outward, leaving behind the illusion that there was never enough to begin with. For the poorest nations, this system is not abstract. It is loss made tangible. Economists estimate that developing countries lose hundreds of billions of dollars each year through tax avoidance and illicit flows. Profits earned from their resources, oil, minerals, crops, are often recorded in shell companies based in havens. The taxes that could build schools or hospitals vanish before they can be collected. On paper, these countries appear poor. In reality, their wealth is simply elsewhere. Consider the case of Zambia, a nation rich in copper. For decades, foreign companies have mined its land, exported its ore, and declared their profits through subsidiaries registered in low-tax jurisdictions. The copper leaves the ground, the profits leave the country, and what remains are empty accounts and worn-out soil. The laws are followed, the contracts signed, the ledgers balanced. Yet something essential, fairness, is missing. The architecture of inequality stands firm because its walls are made of legality. In wealthy nations, the pattern looks different but feels the same. Corporations shift profits offshore to avoid taxes. The wealthiest individuals move their assets into trusts and foundations. The revenue that might have funded public programs vanishes, replaced by austerity. The public is told there is no money for infrastructure, no budget for health, no resources for education. But the money exists. It is simply hidden in places designed not to be found. This hidden architecture shapes not only economies but also politics. When wealth concentrates beyond borders, so does influence. Offshore structures become channels of power, funding campaigns, lobbying governments, and shaping laws. Politicians who benefit from secrecy are unlikely to dismantle it. Policies that favor the hidden world are written in the open one. And so, the system reinforces itself, quietly, efficiently, endlessly. The architecture of inequality is built on a paradox. It claims neutrality while deepening division. Offshore centers insist they are simply providing a service, that they treat all clients equally. But equality of service is not equality of effect. The benefits of secrecy accrue to those who already have much to hide. For the rest of the world, the cost is invisibly shared, in lower wages, weaker services, higher prices, and diminished trust. There is a human cost to this system that statistics cannot measure. It is the erosion of faith. Faith in fairness, in institutions, in the idea that effort leads to reward. When people sense that the game is rigged, that the rules apply differently to those with means, cynicism grows. Democracy weakens not through coups or violence, but through quiet disillusionment. Offshore finance feeds that disillusionment. It whispers that transparency is naive and accountability optional. Some defenders of the system argue that offshore finance supports investment. They say it lubricates the gears of globalization, allowing capital to move freely where it is needed. There is truth in that, but freedom for capital often means captivity for everyone else. When wealth can move without restriction, workers, governments, and communities lose bargaining power. The rules of the global economy begin to serve mobility, not humanity. In the architecture of inequality, every piece is interdependent. The small island offering tax exemptions relies on the law firm drafting the paperwork. The law firm depends on the bank providing accounts. The bank depends on clients from wealthy nations. The clients depend on weak regulations back home. It is a chain of consent, not conspiracy. Everyone plays their role. Everyone claims innocence, yet the outcome is collective, a world tilted toward those already standing on higher ground. Inequality sustained by secrecy is harder to fight because it hides in respectability. There are no villains in dark alleys, no stolen bags of cash. There are board meetings, legal opinions, and polished explanations. The machinery of extraction hums quietly, disguised as management. Even those who benefit may not see themselves as complicit. They are simply playing the game well. But games have rules, and when those rules bend too far, they break the players who cannot afford to cheat. For the middle class in many countries, the offshore world feels like a distant concern, yet its effects touch them every day. The underfunded school, the overcrowded hospital, the rising taxes, all are connected to wealth that has escaped accountability. When money leaves, responsibility follows. The architecture of inequality also builds walls between nations. Wealthy countries often criticize tax havens abroad while nurturing their own versions at home. The United States, for instance, has become one of the largest secrecy jurisdictions in the world, thanks to lax laws in states like Delaware and South Dakota. The hypocrisy is not malicious. It is systemic. Every nation wants to attract capital. Few want to lose it. The result is a global race to the bottom, each country lowering its standards to remain competitive. Yet the most profound inequality may not be economic but emotional. Offshore wealth creates a parallel reality, one where laws can be navigated like options, not obligations. It produces a sense of detachment, a separation between those who live under systems and those who live above them. In that distance, empathy fades. The world divides not only by income but by visibility. Some live in the light of scrutiny, others in the shade of exemption. There are moments, though, when the structure trembles. Leaks like the Panama and Paradise Papers expose its inner workings. Protests rise when austerity bites too deep. Reform movements demand transparency, but the architecture is resilient. It adapts, it absorbs, it waits, because at its core it is not a conspiracy of the few. It is the compromise of the many, the willingness to accept inequality as inevitable, as natural as the price of progress. And so the buildings of glass continue to rise, offshore accounts continue to grow. The distance between visibility and privilege widens almost imperceptibly, yet beneath the calm surface of the global economy, the cracks deepen. Inequality is not just a number or a graph, it is a silence. The silence of what could have been built, healed, or shared if wealth had not learned to disappear. The architecture of inequality stands not because it is strong, but because it is elegant, designed to look harmless, to feel inevitable, to seem too complex to change. But every structure, no matter how solid, depends on the ground beneath it. And the ground, the trust, the faith, the shared belief in fairness, is beginning to shift. When that foundation moves, the towers will tremble. Not with noise or collapse, but with the slow, quiet reckoning of a world remembering what justice is meant to look like. Chapter 8: The Offshore Mindset. It begins not with a law or a loophole, but with a feeling, a quiet discomfort with exposure. The offshore world was not created by accountants or lawyers alone. It was built by a state of mind, a way of seeing the world through the lens of self-preservation. The offshore mindset is psychological before it is financial. It is the belief that safety lies in separation, that wealth must be shielded from the chaos of the world, that visibility is a threat. To understand this mindset, imagine standing at the edge of a calm sea. The horizon stretches endlessly, blue on blue. Somewhere beyond it are the rules, the taxes, the demands of governments and societies. Here near the shore, the air feels lighter. Offshore finance promises this same horizon, the illusion of distance from danger, the comfort of being untouchable. It is not greed that draws most people to it, but the fear of losing control. Fear is a quiet motivator. It whispers, not shouts. For many who hide wealth offshore, it begins with anxiety, the fear of economic instability, political change, or public scrutiny. They tell themselves they are not avoiding duty, only protecting what they've earned. They want safety for their children, privacy for their families, stability for their legacy. These are deeply human desires. The offshore world simply learned how to turn them into business. Over time, fear hardens into philosophy. The person who once sought safety begins to see concealment as a virtue. They start to believe that the world is too unpredictable to be trusted, that governments waste money, that taxes are a form of theft. The logic becomes circular. The system cannot be trusted because others hide their wealth, and others hide their wealth because the system cannot be trusted. This is the offshore mindset. A collective withdrawal from the social contract, one quiet account at a time. At its core lies an illusion of independence. Offshore wealth creates the sense that one can exist outside the web of responsibility. That money, once hidden, becomes free, detached from borders, politics, and obligation. But freedom without connection is isolation. The offshore mindset mistakes solitude for strength. It builds walls of secrecy and calls them protection, unaware that they also seal off empathy. There is also a psychological seduction in invisibility. To be unseen is to be unjudged. The wealthy, often living under the gaze of society, find relief in the anonymity offshore systems offer. Their status disappears. A billion-dollar company looks the same as a small family trust. There are no crowds, no headlines, no accountability, only the soothing quiet of paperwork. In that silence, the conscience can rest. But the offshore mindset does not belong only to the rich. It seeps through culture in subtle ways. When people believe that everyone cheats a little, that systems are rigged, that fairness is a myth, they begin to act accordingly. Small acts of avoidance mirror larger ones. The spirit of offshore thinking moves from boardrooms to households, from corporations to individuals. It becomes not a tactic, but a worldview. In this worldview, transparency feels naive. Cooperation feels risky. Generosity feels unwise. The self becomes the only reliable institution. Wealth, once a tool for living, becomes a fortress. It is measured not by its usefulness, but by its distance from vulnerability. The offshore world reinforces this instinct with elegant precision. It offers security accounts, blind trusts, private foundations, layers of insulation for every possible fear. Each new structure adds not only protection, but also separation. The psychology of concealment has another side, the thrill of mastery. Many who use offshore systems see themselves as playing a complex game. They admire the creativity of the structure, the precision of the strategy. The feeling of outsmarting the system becomes addictive. The more intricate the design, the deeper the satisfaction. What begins as a defensive move turns into an assertion of power, proof that they can move through the world unseen. And yet, beneath the sophistication lies something very old, distrust. The offshore mindset is the natural evolution of centuries of insecurity. Monarchs hoarding gold, merchants hiding profits, families burying wealth during wars. It is the continuation of a long human story about protection from loss. The difference now is scale. What was once done in fear of invasion is now done in fear of taxation. The threat has changed shape, but the instinct remains the same. This mindset is often justified by a simple argument. Everyone would do it if they could, and perhaps that is true, but that truth carries a quiet tragedy. If everyone withdrew from responsibility, if every fortune escaped sight, the world would collapse under its own invisibility. The offshore system depends on the assumption that most people will remain visible, that workers will pay taxes, governments will function, and public systems will endure. The hidden world can only exist because the visible one continues to carry the weight. The offshore mindset thrives because it is rewarded. In a global economy, those who protect their assets are seen as prudent, not selfish. Financial advisors speak of efficiency and optimization, turning moral choices into technical ones. The language itself becomes a shield. Words like protection and planning replace evasion and avoidance. The act of hiding transforms into an act of intelligence. This normalization of concealment creates a subtle emotional divide. On one side are those who believe in shared responsibility, who see taxes and transparency as part of a functioning society. On the other are those who see these as burdens, costs to be minimized, obstacles to be bypassed. The divide is not just economic, but psychological. It separates those who see themselves as part of a system from those who see themselves apart from it. There is a loneliness in this separation. The offshore world promises safety, but it isolates those who live within it. True wealth, once hidden, becomes abstract. It no longer builds communities or fosters connection. It sits quietly in distant accounts, accumulating interest but losing meaning. For all its sophistication, the offshore mindset leads to a peculiar emptiness, the sense of being protected from a world one no longer belongs to. Still, the allure of invisibility endures. It offers control in a world that feels unpredictable. It promises peace of mind in a time of constant exposure. It turns money into sanctuary. But every sanctuary has walls, and every wall separates. The more we build them, the less we see each other. In the end, the offshore mindset is not about numbers, but about trust, or the loss of it. It is what happens when the human need for safety outweighs the human need for connection. It is a response to fear, disguised as freedom, and like all illusions of safety, it leaves its builders vulnerable to the one thing they hope to escape: isolation from the very society that made their wealth possible. The tragedy of the offshore world is not just that it hides money, but that it hides people. behind laws, behind systems, behind fear. And in that hiding, something human is quietly lost. Chapter 9: The Nations That Serve the Hidden. They are small dots on a vast map, names that sound like postcards. The Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Jersey, Luxembourg, Singapore. They are the quiet servants of global wealth, each one a stage upon which the drama of invisibility unfolds. To the casual traveler, they are places of calm beauty and leisure. To the world's financial elite, they are something else entirely. Gates to secrecy, guardians of a system that runs not on sunlight but on silence. These nations and territories are not accidents of geography. They are deliberate creations, shaped by the politics of power and the hunger for relevance. The story of these nations begins with dependence. Many were once colonies of empires whose influence stretched across the seas. When those empires receded, they left behind fragments, small territories with little land, few resources, and limited autonomy. Independence, for many, was a fragile dream. Their economies had to find a new identity in a world that no longer needed their sugar, their spices, or their ports. What they discovered was a different kind of export: discretion. The Cayman Islands were among the first to master it. Once a quiet British territory with little more than fishing and tourism, they reinvented themselves in the 1960s. The transformation began with a few strategic laws. The government abolished income and corporate taxes. It guaranteed confidentiality for investors. It welcomed foreign banks with open arms. Within a generation, this small island chain became one of the most important financial hubs in the world. By the early 2000s, the Cayman Islands held more registered companies than residents, a silent metropolis of paper entities. Bermuda followed a similar path. Its government courted insurance companies, offering favorable laws and a promise of political stability. In return, these firms brought billions in assets. The island prospered, its per capita income rising to rival that of the wealthiest nations. Yet its success depended on a paradox. The money that made Bermuda rich did not belong to Bermuda. It merely passed through, a tide of capital that left its mark without leaving roots. Across the Atlantic, the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey found their own niche. Still tied to the British crown but not bound by British tax laws, they occupied a unique space between sovereignty and subordination. They specialized in trusts, legal arrangements that allowed wealth to be owned without being owned, to belong to someone and no one at the same time. Their old stone buildings and medieval streets became the backdrop for a modern kind of alchemy, turning identity into abstraction. Then there was Luxembourg, small but mighty, nestled in the heart of Europe. For decades, it built its reputation as a financial haven behind polite diplomacy. Luxembourg's strength was subtlety. It did not flaunt secrecy, it institutionalized it. With the protection of European respectability, it became the quiet engine of multinational tax planning. Corporations shifted profits through its maze of subsidiaries, reducing tax bills in countries far larger than Luxembourg itself. In Asia, Singapore emerged as the offshore world's eastern pillar. Unlike the islands that sold secrecy out of necessity, Singapore did so out of strategy. It positioned itself as the financial gateway to Asia. Clean, efficient, stable. Its secrecy laws were cloaked in professionalism, its tax incentives framed as competitiveness. Here, offshore finance shed its tropical disguise and dressed in the language of progress. The money that flowed through Singapore was not hidden behind palm trees, but behind glass towers and regulatory nuance. Each of these places tells a version of the same story. Smallness turned into strength, vulnerability turned into leverage. They learned that what they lacked in size they could replace with law. A single paragraph in legislation could attract billions. A promise of privacy could build a skyline. In a world where money moves faster than morality, these nations became indispensable. They were not rogue states but service providers, catering to the anxieties and ambitions of the powerful. Yet their relationships with the larger world remain delicate. They exist in a moral gray zone, too small to dictate global policy, too important to ignore. When criticized for enabling tax evasion or corruption, they respond with the same refrain: everything we do is legal. And they are right. Their systems operate within the boundaries of international law, a law often written or influenced by the same powerful nations whose citizens use them. Indeed, many of the biggest offshore centers remain tied to their old empires. The British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, and the Cayman Islands are still connected to the United Kingdom. Their local governments pass laws, but ultimate authority rests in London. The United Kingdom, in turn, benefits quietly from their existence. London's own financial district acts as the gateway to their networks. The City of London, that ancient square mile of wealth and tradition, is where the offshore world meets the onshore one. Money enters through the islands and surfaces in the city, cleansed and respectable. In this way, the relationship between havens and global powers is symbiotic. The small nations provide the discretion, the large ones provide legitimacy. The system functions like a set of nested dolls, each layer hiding the next. The outer layer is the island, the visible haven. The inner layer is the law firm, the bank, the accountant. And at the very center sits the client, unseen, unnamed, untouched. For the citizens of these havens, the reality is complex. Offshore finance brings jobs, infrastructure, and prestige. It funds schools, hospitals, and airports, but it also distorts the local economy. Real estate prices soar beyond the reach of ordinary people. The cost of living climbs. The culture bends around the demands of foreign capital. The islands become globalized enclaves, prosperous yet dependent, independent yet controlled. Critics call them parasites, defenders call them survivors. The truth lies somewhere in between. These nations did not invent the hunger for secrecy, they answered it. They turned the world's inequality into their livelihood. They offered what larger countries could not, a quiet space between law and morality, and for this they were rewarded. Still, the illusion of control is fragile when global pressure mounts. After leaks like the Panama or Paradise Papers, these nations find themselves on trial. They issue statements, promise reforms, sign treaties. They adapt, but the system rarely changes. The networks simply shift to other jurisdictions, other laws, other shores. The game continues because the demand never ends. The nations that serve the hidden are not villains in this story. They are mirrors, reflecting the desires of a world that values protection over participation, privacy over fairness. They show us what happens when sovereignty becomes a service, when governance becomes a business. In their calm streets and serene beaches, the offshore world looks harmless, but every calm surface hides depth. These places remind us that power is not only held by those who rule nations, but by those who write their laws, and by those who pay to use them. Their story is one of adaptation, how smallness became power, how weakness became strategy, but it is also a story of consequence. For every dollar sheltered in these islands, another dollar is missing somewhere else. From a school, a hospital, a home. The sea that separates them from the rest of the world is not just water. It is a moral distance, widening with each wave that washes against their shores. Chapter 10: The Cost of Secrecy. Every hidden system leaves a trail, even when it cannot be seen. The offshore world may not steal in the open, but it extracts quietly, draining strength from the societies it claims to exist apart from. Its cost is not measured in billions lost, though those numbers are vast. It is measured in the hollowing of trust, in the slow corrosion of shared purpose. Secrecy does not announce itself as harm. It presents itself as neutrality, as privacy, as strategy, as efficiency. Yet behind that calm disguise lies a profound imbalance, one that shapes the daily lives of people who may never know the system exists. When wealth hides, the burden shifts. The taxes unpaid by those who move their fortunes offshore must still be collected from somewhere. Governments turn inward, pressing those who cannot escape: workers, small businesses, the visible and the ordinary. They bear the cost of invisibility. Roads wear down, schools shrink their budgets, hospitals close wards. In poor nations, it can mean water that isn't clean, medicine that doesn't arrive, teachers who go unpaid. In wealthy nations, it appears as austerity. A quiet narrative of scarcity used to justify cuts, even as trillions rest untouched offshore. The absence becomes invisible, normalized, absorbed into the rhythm of public life. Economists often describe these losses in sterile figures: GDP points, percentages of revenue. But what those numbers represent are lives subtly reshaped. They are the difference between opportunity and resignation, between a society that believes in fairness and one that slowly forgets what it looks like. The cost of secrecy is not just fiscal, it is psychological. It teaches people to doubt that their contribution matters, to suspect that the rules were never meant for everyone. In many developing countries, the offshore system deepens a dependency that began long before it. Colonial histories created extractive economies, designed to send resources outward, not to nourish the people within. Offshore finance modernized that extraction. Now, instead of ships carrying gold and sugar, corporations carry profits through digital channels, moving wealth out of reach before it can even be taxed. The mechanism is legal, efficient, bloodless. But its impact is the same: a flow from periphery to center, from labor to capital, from visibility to invisibility. The nations that lose the most are often the least able to resist. Their laws are weaker, their enforcement underfunded, their elites intertwined with the very systems that drain them. When money leaves, it takes influence with it. Political leaders who benefit from secrecy have little incentive to reform it. The result is a loop: inequality feeding corruption, corruption feeding inequality, all sustained by the quiet hum of offshore accounts that promise safety to those in power and distance from those without it. In the global north, the cost appears more subtle but no less real. Offshore finance has become the shadow infrastructure of capitalism. It allows multinational corporations to shift profits to low-tax jurisdictions while keeping their operations in high-cost economies. The companies that play this game gain an advantage over those that don't. competition becomes uneven, the honest are punished for their transparency. Over time, the incentive structure bends. Success becomes tied not to innovation or productivity, but to mastery of opacity. The cleverest accountants win, not the most creative builders. And beneath it all, ordinary citizens absorb the quiet consequences. They pay higher taxes, face fewer public services, and live within systems that increasingly feel tilted against them. When they see governments unable or unwilling to act, cynicism replaces confidence. Civic faith erodes. The idea that society functions through mutual responsibility gives way to individual survival. If they don't pay, why should I? Becomes a silent refrain. The offshore world does not destroy societies through sudden collapse. It dissolves them through disconnection. There is also an emotional cost that reaches far beyond economics. Secrecy separates people from one another. It creates invisible walls between those who know and those who do not, those who can protect their wealth and those who cannot. It divides communities along lines that cannot be seen but are deeply felt. Resentment festers quietly in that space. The belief that justice is possible fades. The wealthy retreat behind private systems. Private schools, private security, private health care. Until their lives no longer intersect with the public realm at all, the social fabric unravels not with violence, but with withdrawal. The irony is that secrecy was often justified as protection against instability, yet it breeds the very instability it seeks to avoid. When inequality deepens and trust decays, societies grow brittle. They lose their cohesion, their shared sense of future. The hidden wealth that was meant to provide security instead creates fragility. A world where prosperity depends on opacity and peace depends on ignorance. The environment bears its own share of the cost. Many of the industries that use offshore structures, mining, oil, timber, do so to obscure responsibility. Profits are booked offshore while pollution remains local. Communities poisoned by extraction struggle to seek justice because the companies responsible exist only as names in distant registries. Offshore finance has made it possible to own without accountability, to profit without presence. The earth itself becomes collateral in the economy of secrecy. Even culture bends under the weight of what is hidden. In films, in politics, in conversation, the offshore world is often portrayed as a distant curiosity. Exotic islands, corrupt tycoons, suitcases of cash. But the truth is quieter and closer. The offshore system is not a parallel universe. It is woven into the fabric of everyday life. It underwrites mortgages, pensions, insurance policies. It funds campaigns and shapes legislation. Its cost is embedded in the price of what is missing. The roads not repaired, the clinics not built, the futures deferred. And yet, because its damage is diffused, it rarely provokes outrage for long. People adapt, economies adjust, politicians move on. The absence becomes normal, the missing becomes invisible. That is the genius and cruelty of secrecy. Its effects are felt everywhere but seen nowhere. It allows harm to continue precisely because it hides its own existence. Still, there are moments when the curtain lifts. A leak, a scandal, a sudden resignation, and the world glimpses the architecture of concealment. For a brief time, outrage returns, but outrage too is fleeting. The offshore system counts on that. Its greatest defense is not its complexity, but its calm. It knows that the world prefers comfort to confrontation, routine to reckoning. The true cost of secrecy, then, is measured not just in money, but in imagination. It limits what societies believe they can afford, what they think is possible, what they dare to demand. When people are told that scarcity is inevitable, that budgets are tight, that generosity is impossible, they stop asking who decided it should be so. Secrecy narrows the horizon of belief. It turns abundance into myth. And yet understanding this cost is the first step toward reclaiming what has been lost. To name what is hidden is to begin to make it visible again. The offshore world depends on silence, on the assumption that no one is watching, that the losses are too abstract to matter. But when silence breaks, even slightly, the illusion weakens. The cost of secrecy is vast, but it is not irreversible. What has been hidden can be revealed. What has been taken can be restored. What has been accepted as normal can be seen for what it is. A choice, not a fate. The question that remains is not whether the world can afford to end secrecy, but whether it can afford to keep paying its price. Chapter 11. Cracks in the Veil. For decades, the offshore world existed in near-perfect silence. It was a shadow economy that operated beside the visible one, not in opposition to it, but within it, feeding from it, feeding it in return. It survived because it was quiet, because it never made noise. But every quiet world eventually meets its sound. The first cracks in the offshore veil did not come from governments or laws, they came from people. From curiosity, from courage, from a sense of exhaustion with the idea that power should always remain unseen. The earliest challenges to offshore secrecy came not through rebellion but through accident. A stray document, a leaked memo, a mistake in a filing, a journalist following a name too far. The system's strength, its complexity, was also its weakness. The more layers it built, the more chances there were for something to slip through. One broken seal, one misplaced file, and the illusion of invisibility could shatter. In 2016, when the Panama Papers were released, it felt like a sudden storm in a cloudless sky. 11.5 million documents spilled into public view. Contracts, emails, scanned passports. They revealed not a few crimes, but a culture of concealment so vast that the world could hardly absorb it. For the first time, ordinary people saw how deeply the architecture of secrecy ran. They saw their leaders, their celebrities, their corporations woven through the same quiet web. The shock was not in the crimes exposed, but in the realization that so much of it was legal. Behind that revelation stood not institutions, but individuals. Whistleblowers who risked everything, journalists who spent months deciphering codes, editors who chose to publish what could not be ignored. They were not driven by hatred of wealth or ideology. Most were driven by something simpler, the belief that sunlight once cast could not be fully erased. Their work marked the beginning of an era in which the hidden could no longer rely entirely on darkness. The Panama Papers were followed by the Paradise Papers, then the Pandora Papers. Waves of disclosure, each larger than the last. Each leak unveiled another layer of the same pattern. Corporations shifting profits, politicians sheltering fortunes, banks and law firms serving as architects of concealment. The names changed, but the structure did not. Secrecy adapted, as it always does, slipping into new forms, new jurisdictions, new digital disguises. Yet something subtle began to change. The leaks did not bring down the offshore system, but they made it visible in a way it had never been before. Public perception shifted. The quiet assumption that the rich and powerful operated by different rules became not just suspicion, but accepted truth. Governments could no longer claim ignorance. Banks could no longer pretend surprise. The offshore world lost its greatest weapon, anonymity. Still, exposure alone is not the same as transformation. The system, though wounded, endured. Its defenders turned to new arguments. They spoke of reform, of compliance, of cooperation with regulators. They tightened rules just enough to appease critics while keeping the core untouched. The language changed. Secrecy became transparency, havens became jurisdictions, shell companies became entities. The world adjusted its vocabulary, and the offshore machine kept humming. The cracks in the veil did something else, though, something more enduring than outrage. They created understanding. People began to grasp that offshore finance was not a hidden corner of the world economy, but its central nervous system. Every revelation connected the dots between inequality, corruption, and legality. The leaks were like constellations, scattered points that once traced revealed a shape that had always been there. In newsroom after newsroom, journalists pieced together stories that no single government would have dared to tell. They uncovered networks linking politicians to donors, corporations to tax shelters, criminals to clean money. They did what laws could not. They gave secrecy a face, a texture, a geography. The result was a slow unmasking, a gradual erosion of myth. Offshore finance was no longer a mysterious elite domain. It was a human story, told in contracts and emails, in greed and fear. But the work came at a cost. Whistleblowers lived in hiding. Journalists faced lawsuits, harassment, and in some cases death. The most haunting was Daphne Caruana Galizia, a Maltese journalist who investigated corruption tied to offshore accounts. In 2017, she was killed by a car bomb. Her death became a symbol of what it costs to challenge secrecy, the way darkness fights back when light gets too close. And yet, despite fear, the cracks continued to widen. International bodies began to act. The European Union established blacklists of tax havens. The United Nations pushed for transparency in ownership registries. The G20 demanded information sharing among banks. Slowly, the offshore world found itself under scrutiny, but scrutiny is not always pressure. Much of it was symbolic, a gesture of accountability rather than its reality. The truth is that the offshore system does not need to hide as it once did. It has become too large to fear exposure. Its logic has been absorbed into global finance itself. The belief that capital must always be free, that mobility is a virtue, that taxation is an obstacle to growth. The leaks embarrassed individuals but did not dismantle the mindset. They revealed the machinery, but the machinery kept turning, its hum drowned by the world's endless noise. Yet cracks once opened never fully close. Each leak leaves behind an echo, a memory that cannot be undone. People remember the names, the patterns, the feeling of recognition. That quiet click when something hidden finally makes sense. The offshore world relies on fatigue, but awareness has its own endurance. It grows slowly, beneath the surface, shaping new generations who see secrecy not as sophistication, but as evasion. Even now, as technology creates new kinds of opacity, cryptocurrencies, digital trusts, algorithmic trading, the spirit of exposure persists. Somewhere, someone collects evidence. Somewhere a file waits to be shared. The fight between concealment and revelation has become a rhythm of its own. Neither side wins, both adapt. What changes is the light itself. Brighter, sharper, harder to contain. The cracks in the veil do not yet reveal the full picture. They reveal fragments, glimpses of how power truly works, how wealth circulates unseen, how rules bend quietly around influence. But fragments are enough. They are the beginning of seeing. Each document, each leak, each whisper widens the distance between illusion and understanding. Perhaps that is how all change begins, not with collapse but with cracks. The offshore system may never fall with a single blow. It may dissolve instead, through exposure and fatigue, through the growing realization that what is hidden is never as stable as it seems. Every empire of secrecy, no matter how vast, carries within it the seeds of its own unmasking. And so the cracks widen. They are small, almost invisible from afar, but they are there. In the headlines that fade, in the questions that linger, in the quiet unease of those who now know too much to pretend they do not. The veil still stands, but it is thinner than before, and somewhere beyond it, the light waits patiently, knowing that its time always comes. Chapter 12: The Ordinary Offshore. When people hear the words offshore finance, they imagine yachts, hidden vaults, and secret meetings in glass towers. They picture the faces of billionaires, politicians, and tycoons. But the truth is quieter, more unsettling, and far more intimate. Offshore is not a world apart from us. It is woven into the systems we use every day. It touches our pensions, our groceries, our mortgages, our governments. It hides not only in distant islands, but in the ordinary mechanics of modern life. The extraordinary secret of the offshore world is that it is not exceptional at all. It is ordinary. Consider the companies that shape daily existence, the ones that make phones, clothing, or coffee. Many of them operate through networks of subsidiaries registered in low-tax jurisdictions. A cup of coffee bought in one country may enrich a company incorporated in another, its profits rooted through a third. Each transaction feels simple, but beneath it lies a quiet choreography of financial geography. Every product, every purchase, becomes a thread in the offshore web, connecting lives to places most will never see. Even retirement savings are touched by this invisible world. Pension funds, tasked with growing the futures of millions, invest in global portfolios that flow through offshore structures. They do this not to hide but to optimize, to minimize taxes, to reduce risk, to increase returns. It is the language of efficiency, not secrecy, and yet the result is the same. Money moves through shadows, unseen but active, accumulating in spaces designed for discretion. The retiree who checks their balance each month may never realize that their future rests partly on the same system that shelters billionaires. Governments, too, rely on offshore structures in ways that seem paradoxical. State-owned enterprises, public infrastructure projects, and even development programs often channel funds through offshore accounts. The reason is always the same: efficiency, confidentiality, risk management. In the pursuit of practicality, transparency becomes a luxury. The offshore world has become so normalized that even the institutions meant to regulate it depend on it. It is not an aberration of the system, it is the system. Banks are its arteries. Every salary deposit, every mortgage payment, Every online transaction flows through a network of institutions that operate globally. Behind their local branches lie vast webs of offshore subsidiaries, vehicles for balance sheet management, regulatory arbitrage, and tax planning. The money that passes through your account may spend a moment in the Cayman Islands before reaching its destination. You will never know, and you were never meant to. Offshore finance has become like oxygen, invisible, everywhere, and indispensable. The same is true for digital companies. The platforms that connect people, that define modern communication and consumption, are built upon offshore frameworks. When you stream music, order a product, or send a message, your data, and the revenue it generates, travels through a maze of jurisdictions. These companies have perfected the art of the intangible. Their assets are not buildings or machines, but algorithms and brands. They exist everywhere and nowhere, perfectly suited for the offshore age. And so the offshore world has crept quietly into the everyday. It no longer belongs only to those who consciously seek secrecy. It belongs to the infrastructure of modern capitalism itself, diffuse, normalized, and accepted. The line between the hidden and the visible has blurred beyond recognition. What once seemed exotic is now routine. The offshore mindset has become embedded in the logic of institutions, corporations, and even individuals. It is tempting to think of offshore finance as distant, as something happening out there, but it begins with ordinary decisions. A company choosing where to register its patents, an investor deciding where to hold assets, a government deciding which regulations to ease. Each choice feels minor, even rational. Together, they form a global architecture of invisibility. Offshore is not a place. It is a direction, away from accountability toward abstraction. The consequence of this ordinariness is subtle but profound. Because offshore systems are everywhere, they are also nowhere to blame. When a scandal arises, responsibility dissolves. Corporations point to intermediaries. Intermediaries point to laws. Governments point to global norms. The circle closes and the problem appears too large to solve. It is the same logic that governs pollution. Everyone contributes a little. No one is guilty enough to change. Offshore finance has mastered this invisibility of guilt. Yet within this ordinariness lies a quiet danger, numbness. When secrecy becomes common, it stops feeling wrong. When avoidance becomes strategy, it stops feeling selfish. The offshore system has taught the world to see evasion as expertise, concealment as competence. People admire efficiency without asking what it costs. Nations compete to offer more favorable conditions for wealth, proud of attracting investment, while unaware that they are hosting absence. This numbness extends into language itself. Words like optimization, jurisdictional planning, and asset protection sound harmless, even intelligent. They strip away the moral weight of what they describe. The financial world has become fluent in euphemism, a language that makes the extraordinary ordinary, that turns questions of justice into matters of management. It is not that people no longer care about fairness. It is that the language of fairness no longer fits the world as it is. Still, the ordinariness of offshore life also carries potential. What is normalized can be questioned. What is everywhere can be seen. Awareness, once faint, grows sharper. Leaks and investigations have shown that the offshore world is not impenetrable. It can be mapped, studied, challenged. Activists, economists, and citizens are beginning to ask not just who hides money, but why the world allows hiding to be profitable at all. In this shift lies a glimmer of hope, not a revolution but a reawakening. People are beginning to see connections that were once invisible. They see that offshore finance is not just about taxes or law, it is about power and design. It shapes who contributes and who withdraws, who bears risk and who avoids it. To question the offshore world is to question the structure of modern prosperity itself. Yet change comes slowly, because the offshore system is as human as it is financial. It reflects the quiet desires and fears that run through everyone, the wish to be safe, the instinct to protect what is one's own, the temptation to step outside the rules when the rules feel unfair. Offshore finance gives these emotions form and legality. It turns private impulses into public architecture. To change, it is not only to reform a system, but to confront the psychology that built it. The ordinary offshore is, in the end, a mirror. It shows that secrecy is not confined to the powerful. It is embedded in the habits of the world itself. It reveals how easily we accept opacity when it serves convenience, how quickly we trade visibility for advantage. The offshore system is not the story of a few bad actors. It is the story of a civilization that has learned to live comfortably with what it does not see. The next time money moves silently between accounts, the next time a company boasts of efficiency, the next time a government pleads poverty, the offshore world will be there. Not as a hidden realm, but as an invisible presence. It is not elsewhere. It is here, moving quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life, shaping what we think is normal, and waiting for the moment when normal finally begins to change. Chapter 13: The Moral Crossroads. At some point, every system meets a question it can no longer postpone. What does it mean to be right? The offshore world has reached that question, though it rarely speaks it aloud. For decades, its existence has been justified by the law, by the simple defense that everything it does is legal. But legality, stripped of morality, becomes a hollow compass. It points in directions that lead nowhere. The real crisis of offshore finance is not economic, it is ethical. To understand this, we must step back and look at the shape of the world it has helped create. A world where wealth can vanish but consequences cannot. A world where the rich can build fortresses of invisibility while the poor stand in the open. A world that measures success by what can be hidden. The offshore system is not just a financial invention, it is a moral experiment. It tests how far people will stretch the idea of fairness before it breaks. Every justification for secrecy begins with a story. A family protecting itself from instability, a business shielding assets from predatory governments, a nation trying to stay competitive. These stories are true, or at least they begin that way. But morality does not erode in grand moments. It erodes in justifications, in the quiet, logical steps that move people from need to privilege, from protection to power. Offshore finance is built from those steps, one reasonable decision at a time. There is an ancient tension at the heart of it, self-interest versus collective good. Humans have always balanced between the two, seeking safety while depending on others for survival. Civilization itself is a negotiation between the personal and the public. Offshore finance disturbs that balance. It tilts the scale toward the self, rewarding those who can separate their fortunes from the systems that sustain them. It turns what was once mutual obligation into a game of avoidance. The moral weight of this shift is heavy because it hides behind normalcy. The lawyer who drafts a trust does not feel corrupt. The banker who manages an offshore fund does not feel immoral. Each believes they are doing their job, following rules, serving clients, but morality rarely reveals itself in single actions. It lives in outcomes. And the outcome of the offshore system is clear. It widens the distance between those who can choose the rules they live under and those who cannot. The crossroads, then, is not between legality and illegality, but between responsibility and detachment. To participate in the offshore world is to make a choice about what kind of world one believes in. Do we see ourselves as part of a shared story, bound by common duties, or as individuals navigating a landscape where only the clever survive? Offshore finance thrives on the latter belief. It promises control in a world that feels uncertain, autonomy in a world that feels chaotic. But it offers that control by eroding the very bonds that make stability possible. Morality at its simplest is a recognition of connection, the understanding that our actions ripple outward, touching lives we will never see. Offshore finance severs those ripples. It creates a form of wealth detached from consequence. When money moves unseen, so does accountability. Decisions that affect millions. The funding of a school, the staffing of a hospital, the collapse of a currency, are influenced by choices made in private offices thousands of miles away. The harm is diffuse, the responsibility evaporated. This is what makes the moral question so elusive. There is no single villain to blame, no crime to prosecute. There is only a structure that rewards detachment and punishes transparency. The lawyer, the banker, the politician, the investor. Each plays a part too small to seem culpable, but together they form a pattern that no one claims and everyone sustains. Offshore finance survives precisely because it feels innocent. Still, the crossroads is not entirely hopeless. In recent years, a quiet moral awakening has begun. It is visible in the work of investigative journalists, in the demands for transparency, in the movements calling for fair taxation. It is visible in citizens who question not just who hides money, but why systems reward hiding in the first place. The morality of money, long thought private, is becoming public again. People are beginning to see that wealth, like power, carries responsibility. Not because it must, but because without it, society fractures. This awakening is not universal. For every reformer, there is a defender of the status quo. For every call for transparency, there is a new loophole, a new jurisdiction, a new way to hide. The struggle is not between good and evil, but between vision and comfort, between those who imagine a fairer system and those who find safety in the one that exists. Offshore finance represents the triumph of comfort over connection. It is the materialization of a collective decision to look away. And yet morality has a way of resurfacing, even after long silence. It appears in the language of outrage when another leak surfaces. It appears in the faces of those who cannot afford invisibility. It appears in the quiet guilt of those who benefit from secrecy but know its cost. The human conscience, though often buried beneath convenience, is resilient. It returns in moments of reckoning, asking the same question in different forms. What do we owe to one another? The moral crossroads of offshore finance extends beyond wealth. It is a reflection of how modern society defines value. We live in an age that prizes mobility, autonomy, and efficiency, all qualities embodied by the offshore system. But those same qualities, when left unanchored, can hollow out the meaning of community. A society that rewards invisibility eventually forgets how to see. There are, of course, no simple answers. To demand the end of secrecy is to challenge centuries of habit, to confront not just systems but beliefs. It is to ask people who have been trained to equate safety with separation to imagine safety in solidarity instead. That is a radical request, but morality has always been radical. It asks us to see beyond the limits of self-interest, to recognize that our security is bound to the security of others. At this crossroads, the offshore world faces a choice it cannot avoid forever. It can continue to defend its legality and efficiency, building ever higher walls of abstraction, or it can begin to acknowledge its role in shaping a global inequality that no amount of discretion can hide. The first path preserves the illusion of control. The second admits vulnerability and invites change. Both carry risk. Only one carries the possibility of meaning. The moral crisis of the offshore world is, in truth, the moral crisis of our time. The quiet struggle between connection and isolation, between participation and withdrawal. Offshore finance is not just a financial structure. It is a mirror held up to human behavior. It reflects what we choose to value when no one is watching. At the crossroads, the choice is simple, though not easy: to keep walking deeper into invisibility or to turn back toward the light. Not the harsh light of exposure, but the soft, steady light of accountability. Because morality in the end is not about punishment. It is about belonging. It is about remembering that even in a world as complex as ours, what we owe to one another is still the simplest thing of all: to be seen and to see. Chapter 14: The Future of Secrecy. Secrecy has always adapted faster than those who try to expose it. It changes shape like water poured from one vessel to another, taking the form of whatever holds it. Once it lived in steel vaults and paper ledgers. Now it lives in servers, in code, in invisible strings of data that flow across borders faster than thought. The offshore world is not vanishing. It is mutating. The question is not whether secrecy will survive, but what it will become. The future of secrecy begins not on a tropical island, but on a screen. In the digital age, geography is losing its meaning. A company can be registered in one country, managed in another, and exist entirely in the cloud. The paperwork that once passed through law firms in the Caribbean now moves through encrypted platforms. The shell company has evolved into the algorithmic entity. The new havens are not defined by palm trees or post office boxes, but by code and jurisdictional blind spots. Secrecy no longer needs paradise, it only needs bandwidth. Cryptocurrency has taken this evolution to its logical extreme. It is money without a home, wealth without a nation. Its defenders call it liberation, a way to free financial systems from government control. Its critics call it the perfect vessel for concealment. Both are right. In the world of digital assets, ownership becomes fluid, identity becomes optional, and transactions leave trails that are visible yet indecipherable. The blockchain, often praised for transparency, paradoxically enables new forms of opacity. The names vanish, replaced by keys and addresses. Control passes from law to logic. But secrecy's digital future extends beyond currency. Artificial intelligence, data encryption, and decentralized storage are reshaping how information itself is hidden. What used to require complex networks of intermediaries can now be achieved with a few lines of code. A digital trust can be created, managed, and dissolved without ever touching paper. The secrecy once reserved for the few has become scalable. accessible to anyone with the right tools. The next offshore is not a place you can visit. It is an architecture you can download. Governments are struggling to keep pace. Regulation was designed for borders. Digital finance ignores them. Tax systems built on physical presence collapse when corporations exist everywhere and nowhere. Transparency laws, once groundbreaking, now feel outdated before they are even enacted. Every attempt to catch the hidden world reveals how far it has already moved. The chase between oversight and innovation has become endless, a dance in which secrecy always leads. This does not mean the old havens are disappearing. The Caymans, Luxembourg, and Singapore remain vital nodes in the global network, but they are evolving too. They are building digital infrastructures, offering data hosting privileges, crypto-friendly laws, and virtual company registrations. The same islands that once promised anonymity through distance now sell it through technology. They have traded palm leaves for fiber optic cables, turning themselves into hybrid spaces. Half paradise, half server farm. The moral arguments around secrecy are changing as well. For younger generations raised in a world of constant surveillance, privacy feels less like luxury and more like necessity. In a society where every movement is tracked, the desire to hide is no longer the preserve of the powerful. It becomes a defense mechanism. In this sense, the future of secrecy will not be defined solely by wealth, but by fear. Fear of exposure, fear of control, fear of losing autonomy. The same systems that protect billionaires may soon appeal to ordinary citizens trying to reclaim a fragment of invisibility. This duality, secrecy as both corruption and protection, will define the decades ahead. Technology blurs the line between the right to privacy and the right to know. Whistleblowers use encryption to expose injustice. Criminals use it to hide. Governments use surveillance to catch wrongdoing. Corporations use it to control. The battle between openness and secrecy becomes not moral, but existential. It is no longer about who hides, but about who decides what should be seen. In this shifting landscape, the language of finance is merging with the language of technology. Smart contracts, decentralized autonomous organizations, zero-knowledge proofs. These are the new forms of secrecy, built not from law but from logic. They create systems where trust is replaced by code, where transparency exists only in theory. Each innovation brings efficiency, but also abstraction. The more the system evolves, the further it drifts from human comprehension. Secrecy no longer hides behind law firms or numbered accounts. It hides behind complexity itself. And yet there is resistance. Across the world, movements for financial transparency are gaining momentum. Activists are calling for public ownership registries, digital oversight, and accountability in cryptocurrency markets. Technology, after all, can illuminate as easily as it can conceal. The same digital networks that enable secrecy can also trace it, reveal it, document it. The same algorithms that obscure can be rewritten to expose. The future of secrecy will depend not just on the tools we invent, but on how we choose to use them. Still, change will not come easily. The forces that sustain secrecy are ancient: fear, greed, self-preservation. Technology only gives them new forms. For every transparency initiative, there will be a countermeasure. For every disclosure, a new layer of encryption. The offshore system's survival has never depended on geography, but on imagination. It has always been one step ahead because it understands something fundamental about human nature, the desire to be seen and the equal desire not to be. The next frontier may not be offshore at all. It may be nowhere. The rise of the metaverse, digital identities, and virtual economies promises a world where value exists entirely in simulation. In that world, money may no longer need to hide because it will never fully exist. Wealth will become code, identity will fragment, and secrecy will evolve into something almost metaphysical. The art of existing in layers, of being both present and absent at once. But even in that future, the essence of secrecy will remain the same. It will still be built on trust and fear, still mirror the human wish to control uncertainty. The offshore world may move from islands to algorithms, but it will carry with it the same unspoken questions. Who gets to hide? Who gets to know? Who bears the cost of what remains unseen? Perhaps the future of secrecy will force the world to confront those questions with new urgency. Because as technology erases borders, the old excuses, it's legal, it's elsewhere, it's not my responsibility, will lose their power. The hidden and the visible will merge. Every action, every decision will leave a trace that cannot be fully erased. The future of secrecy, then, is not just a story about money. It is a story about identity, about what it means to live in a world where visibility itself becomes currency. The battle will not be between governments and havens, but between two human instincts, the need for protection and the need for truth. And when the dust settles, when the codes and contracts fade into something new, one truth will remain. No matter how far secrecy evolves, it will always reflect the people who build it. It will always carry the fingerprints of our fears, our ambitions, our longing to be safe from one another, and from ourselves. Chapter 15: The Weight of the Hidden World. In every civilization there are two economies, the one that can be seen and the one that cannot. The visible world is what we read in reports, what we measure in growth, what we argue about in elections. The hidden world moves beneath it, silent and unrecorded, yet shaping everything above. Offshore finance is that shadow, vast, intangible, and heavy with consequence. For decades it has carried the weight of human desire, fear, and ingenuity. Now, as the world begins to understand its scale, the question is no longer just how it works, but what it has done to us. The weight of the hidden world is not only measured in lost money, but in lost connection. It is the invisible distance that grows between those who have learned how to disappear and those who cannot. Every offshore account, every trust, every hidden fund is a quiet act of withdrawal, not just from taxation or scrutiny, but from participation. It is a way of saying, I exist apart from you. Over time, that sentiment becomes a system, and the system becomes a culture. The more wealth hides, the less it feels bound to the world that made it possible. We often speak of money as neutral, but it never is. Money carries memory of who earned it, who spent it, who was left behind. When it disappears into offshore structures, that memory fades. It stops being part of a shared story and becomes private, sealed behind contracts and codes. The hidden world erases context. It turns wealth into abstraction, untethered from the lives and labor that produced it. And when enough of the world's wealth becomes abstract, so does its morality. The connection between effort and reward, between society and obligation, begins to dissolve. This weight is not just economic or moral. it is emotional. The offshore world thrives on calm surfaces. Glass towers, soft voices, white sand beaches, but beneath that calm lies unease. Those who live in secrecy live in a constant tension between visibility and fear. They crave the safety of invisibility, but fear the loneliness it brings. To hide is to protect oneself, but also to be unseen. The irony of the hidden world is that it promises freedom and delivers isolation. For the rest of the world, the weight is quieter but more pervasive. It seeps into daily life through scarcity, the small indignities of systems that cannot afford what they should, the hospital underfunded by taxes never collected, the teacher whose classroom shrinks while profits soar offshore, the infrastructure that crumbles while hidden accounts swell. The world learns to live with less, not because there is less, but because so much of it has been moved out of reach. In this way, offshore finance reshapes more than economies, it reshapes imagination. It tells people that inequality is inevitable, that fairness is naive, that the world simply works this way. It teaches resignation disguised as realism. And once people stop believing that systems can be fair, the systems lose their reason to be. Democracy weakens not from revolution, but from quiet disbelief. The hidden world grows strongest when the visible world gives up hope. Yet even within this vast architecture of concealment, something fragile endures. The human need to understand. Leaks, investigations, reforms, all of them are acts of resistance against forgetting. They remind us that what is hidden still belongs to the story of us. Every time a file is opened, every time a truth is named, the weight lifts, if only a little. It is not about punishing the hidden world. It is about remembering that it exists within the same moral gravity as everything else. There is a strange paradox at the heart of this. The more we learn about the offshore system, the more we see ourselves in it. It mirrors our fears, our instincts, our contradictions, the need to protect what is ours, the temptation to avoid consequence, the belief that safety lies in control. The offshore world is not a foreign landscape. It is a reflection of the human condition, scaled up and codified into global infrastructure. It shows us what happens when personal fear becomes collective policy. If there is redemption in this story, it lies not in dismantling the system overnight. That may be impossible, but in shifting what we value. The offshore world was built on the idea that invisibility is strength. The future will depend on learning that transparency can be power too. To be seen, to be accountable, to be part of the whole. These are not weaknesses, but forms of resilience. Light, after all, does not destroy what it touches, it reveals it. The weight of the hidden world is also a weight of grief, the quiet sorrow of what could have been. Imagine the hospitals built, the forests preserved, the generations educated if even a fraction of what is hidden were shared. Imagine the trust restored, the cynicism dissolved, the belief renewed that the world could still be fair. That is the moral cost of secrecy, not just what it takes, but what it prevents from ever being born. But perhaps the story does not end in cynicism. The cracks in the veil are widening, the young are watching. They are growing up in a world where exposure is constant, where privacy and secrecy are no longer the same thing. They see through the illusion that wealth and morality must exist apart. They are asking quieter, deeper questions, not about how to hide, but how to rebuild trust. They are beginning to imagine systems where transparency is not punishment, but peace. The hidden world will never vanish completely. There will always be shadows. There will always be corners where power retreats, but awareness is its counterweight. To see the architecture of secrecy is to weaken it. To understand how it functions is to make it less inevitable. The weight of the hidden world presses hardest when it is unnamed. Once named, it begins to lose its gravity. So the story ends not with anger, but with recognition. Offshore finance is not an alien creation. It is a human one, born of fear, refined by intelligence, sustained by silence. To confront it is to confront our own reflection. The hidden world is heavy because it carries all the contradictions of the visible one, our brilliance and our blindness, our empathy and our escape. One day, perhaps, the boundaries between the two will thin. Wealth may return to the societies that shaped it. Systems may learn to reward openness rather than concealment. Trust, though fragile, may find its footing again. Until then, the hidden world continues, quiet, intricate, and vast, drifting beneath the surface of the global sea, waiting for the moment when the tide finally turns and light reaches the depths that were never meant to be seen.